Hello to this new session. In this session, we're going to cover the for each component. Let's explain a bit the basics of this component. First, we have only one default input called input, and two default outputs, one called loop and the other one called result. And in the settings, we have only one settings called output format, with three options: full, minimal, and array of results. First thing that you can notice in this component is that you don't have the option to create new inputs or new outputs. And well, that means that you don't need anything else than these default inputs and outputs. Let's delete this one and let's see how this works. We have here a really basic flow to demonstrate how this component works. We have first an API call component. This specific URL just retrieves random information about users. That information is sent to the for each component. And for each iteration, we have this LLM prompt component that is going to make a summary for each user information. And once the iterations are finished, the results are going to go here to this LLM prompt component that it has the echo option. So it's just going to print the results. And that's it. So here, the first thing that we can notice is that we have an extra output that is extracting some information. So let's talk about a bit about this. Some users make some mistakes because, well, the API call component normally it doesn't have extra outputs. So they can face the problem of, or well, they can make the mistake of passing the entire response to the input, and they can expect the for each component to iterate through the information, the whole information of the response. That is wrong, because let's check. If we run this API call component, we can see that the whole response, yes, indeed, we have an array with three random information about users. But besides that, we have this another object that is called info, and the array is inside this results parameter. So if we deliver the whole response to the for each component, that is not going to work properly. Let's check it out. So we can see that the whole response is delivered to the input of the for each component. And if you execute the for each component, we can see that it's not iterating through the three pieces of information that we have or that we want. It just recognizes as one element, and well, that's not what we want. So the first suggestion about the for each component is to deliver an array, only an array. So in this case, since the array is inside another object, well, we need to isolate the array. In this case, response.results, since the array is in the results key. If we execute again and we check the extra output that we created, now we have only the array. So this is going to be accepted by the for each component. So let's bind that to the input of the for each component. Okay, let's execute again. We check that only the array is delivered to the for each component. And now we can see that the for each component recognizes that it's an array, and we have three elements in that array. So let's continue running this workflow. So since the for each component already ran once, we have the first element of the array in the loop output. that is delivered to this branch, that in this case we only have one component, this LLM prompt component, that is going to make a summary of this information. We execute the LLM prompt component, and in the reply we have the summary. Okay, so if we continue running the workflow, now we have the second element in the loop output, and the same is going to happen. We're going to generate a summary of this information, and the same for the last element of the array. So we finish the iterations. If we run the for each element, for each component one time more, now we deliver all the results in the result output. Here we can find we have an array with 3 pieces of information, and well, each one is the summary that we generate for each element in the array. That goes to this LLM prompt component, and this component is just printing that information. Okay, so that's basically how the for each component works. And now, well, let's talk about the output format. In this case, this for each component is set to the full option. And as you can see, this is the full output format. So it has more details about the executions. In this case, we have an ID, that is the ID of the execution. Name, in this case, we're going to have the name of the component, well, the last component of the loop branch. Let's explain a bit this, because it can confuse. This name, well, we have in the loop branch only one LLM prompt component, but this can have many components. For example, we can add another LLM prompt component. For example, in this case, we're just gonna print the input, and finally we're going to have an API output, and we're gonna call this iteration, and we're gonna bind this. Okay, what happens if we run now the workflow? Okay, now let's check the result. Now in the key name, we have API output. So this name is just going to retrieve the name of the component, the last component from the loop branch. In this case, the last component that we have in the loop branch is the API output component. So we have that name in the results. This can be useful for debugging purposes, because you're going to know what was the last component that was executed. Then, well, let's go back to the original example. Let's iterate once more. Okay, let's continue inspecting the results. Well, we already know which name is going to retrieve here. Then we have the result, reply. This reply name is coming from this output, because in the LLM prompt component we have the reply in this reply default output. And inside the reply, we have the summary. So the full option in the for each component can give you more detailed information about the execution. That can be used, I don't know, for debugging purposes, or maybe maybe you're gonna need this information for I don't know, to send to another component. But yeah, this is the format in the full option. Now let's go to the second option, which is the minimal. This is the same workflow, so let's run it. Okay, let's inspect the result output. And now we have an array, but we don't have that extra information, for example, the ID and the name. We don't have that. We just have the results from the loop branch. In this case, we have the reply and the summary, which is the information that we have from this LLM prompt component. So if you really don't need that extra information that we have in the full option, well, we can set the for each component to the minimal output format, and we're just going to have the results from the loop branch without extra information that maybe we don't need that. Now let's go with the third option, which is array of results. Okay, now let's go to the third option. This third option is special because it has a special purpose. This array of results option is especially made because the for each component normally is used with the async and await components. So for each component to be able to work with these other components, async and await components, where we need a special format in the array that we found in the result output from the for each component. So we're just going to execute this workflow, but we're gonna see this option, this array of result option, in more detail in the session where we're going to talk about the async and await components. So for now, let's just check how is the format of the results of the for each component when we use the array of result option. If we can see that the format of the results is some kind similar to the minimal option, because we just have the results from the loop branch. And yeah, that's it. It's really the information that we have is just the results without extra information like we saw in the full option. So this is the kind of format that we have when we use the array of result option. As I said, we're gonna go deep about this option in the async and await component session. Okay, so now one important detail about the for each component. Let's see an important detail. We're just gonna create an API endpoint called sample. We're just going to create a new output in this API call component called trigger. This is just going to be used to trigger this execution because we don't really need any input in this API call component. And now we're going to delete this component from the results, because as you can see, well, in all this workflow, we are just using this LLM prompt to print the results. Because, well, since we have the results already in this output, you can say, well, why do I need to bind something in this output? So let's check the difference of the execution. binding a component or without binding any component in the result output. To do this, we're going to use the API embodiment. Here we have the sample endpoint that we just create. We're going to execute. And we can see that in response body, we just have an empty array. We are not watching the results of the for each component. So, well, why is that? So that's an important detail that you have to remember about the for each component. You are forced to bind a component in the result output. It can be any component because, well, it can be an API output, or it can be even another workflow that maybe you want to process the results in some way, and you have a complete different workflow here that is going to process the results from the for each component. But there must be a component bind to the for each result default output, because if you don't bind any component, the results are invisible for the agent, as you already saw when we execute the endpoint. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to return to the original workflow where we just we were using the echo option. Just print the input, and we bind to the result output. So now with the original workflow, let's execute the same endpoint, and now we can see that in the response we have our results, the summaries. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind when you are working with the for each component. To be sure that the results are visible to the agent, well, you need to bind a component to the result output. And it can be, like in this case, just to print the results, that you can do that using an LLM prompt with echo, or maybe you want to use an API output. You can name this results connected here. And if we execute again, we have the results. So yeah, that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. And that's it for the output format that we have available in the for each component. Now let's see some tips, maybe some other scenarios to deliver array to the input of the for each component. For example, one way to deliver an array. Let's imagine that you have 3 inputs. That is coming from any other component. It can be an API endpoint or any other component. It can be LLM prompt components. It can be any component, or maybe multiple results from multiple components. We're gonna see it right now. Okay, let's create the respective outputs. Okay, let's imagine that we want to iterate through the 3 inputs that we receive, in this case from the API endpoint component, how to deliver an array to the for each component. So it's as easy as bind the 3 outputs directly to the input of the for each component. Let's try it. And as you can see, what we have in the input of the for each component is an array of the 3 elements, of the 3 outputs that we are receiving from the API endpoint. So that's one trick that you can use to deliver an array to the for each component, to be sure that an array is what the for each is going to receive, and you have a limited data that you want to deliver to this for each component. Well, you just bind each of these data to the default input of the for each component, and an array is going to be built in this site. Another trick, well, the one that we saw in the last session, we can remember also that one. For example, oh no, let's wait. We receive a list of multiple elements. It can be any number of elements in only one input. Well, we can set this input to array type. Let's imagine that this is the list, and since this input is an array is going to be built, and here we have an array, and that array is delivered to the for each component. That's other way where you can deliver an array for the for each component, an array that is going to be recognized correctly. So another case can be, let's imagine that you have I don't know, any kind of workflow, and you have the result of 3 branches. Let's imagine that these are the end of 3 branches, this LLM. And you want to iterate through each result. So again, you can just bind all the results to the default input of the for each element, and you're going to create an array of these 3 results. Just to illustrate the execution, I'm gonna set this, and for each of these we're going to print a default text, in this case test1, test2, test3. So let's execute it. Oh wait. Okay. Oh no. Let's put any kind of value in here. Test. Okay, we have here, and let's imagine that we have a big workflow that ends with these 3 LLM prompts, and we have these results. In this case, let's execute. We have test 1, test 2, and test 3, and what we got in here is an array of these 3 results coming from these LLM prompts. So this is another way that you can directly deliver an array to the for each component, and without having to build, I don't know, maybe another components to make the conversion of a string to an array. Yes, without having to do that, you can just bind these 3 results, and you're going to find an array in the input. So yeah, that's all for this session. We see many things. The for each component is really powerful and really useful for many cases. So if you think that we didn't cover some scenarios that you are facing, well, feel free to post those questions in the Discord server, and you're gonna find someone from SmythOS staff that is going to resolve your doubts. So see you in the next session.